Hello, welcome to Bridging of Ages. My name is Dan Mendlevitz. Today we'll be talking about fathers in the workplace, and we have a wonderful guest today. So we're going to talk about fathers in the workplace, intergenerational differences, improving innovation, resilience, empowering people. It helps navigate uncertainties of modern life and really get a good idea of how it has changed so that the importance of fathers and how they relate to today's workplace. My guest today is Kathryne Imabayashi, and Kathryne is a Canadian nomad who currently lives in Japan. And through her sonhood coaching and her podcast, Unlocking the Parenting Code, All About Boys, Kathryne helps families build strong emotional foundations. She is also author of Raising Boys Who Become Remarkable Men and the upcoming book, Will My Son Become a Good Man? Kathryne is a parent coach through her company, Sonhood Coaching. So today we're going to be talking about fathers in the workplace together. And after a message from our sponsor, Kathryne Imabayashi will be joining us as our guest on Bridging of Ages. Welcome back to Bridging of Ages. If you're just joining us, we'll be talking about fathers in the workplace with Kathryne Imabayashi. Welcome, Kathryne.
Thank you for having me.
Well, great. Let's dive in. So through your work, you've had the opportunity to interview young men from around the world. And wanted to get from, what you've been learning, your sense of what young men and fathers are looking for, especially related to, their work and life.
The biggest thing that comes up when I think about what I have learned and what men are saying and what I see in my own son's world is that there is such a cultural shift in what it means to be a man and all of the issues connected around masculinity. So thinking of the workplace, I think we have to start with what does it mean to be a provider? Because in generations before, and still in my generation somewhat, being a provider meant putting food on the table, being the one who went out and made sure that they made the money that allowed the family to live. So it was quite clear. Um, Nowadays, the role of a young man is very different. Some of the statistics say that young men today participate in childcare twice as much as their own parents did or their own fathers did, and 4 times as much as their grandfathers. So that cultural shift, it has a big impact on everything. Young men that I speak to and that I see they want to be engaged with their families. They want to take on that role, but they're also exhausted because there's this two part of what the expectations are for them, but without some of the understanding and compassion behind it as well. So when you look at workplaces, it's not common for there to be an understanding about the role of the father while they're working there. There's not really the understanding about the mental health crisis that young men are facing today. And those mental health crises don't appear the same as it does for the female workers that are in the business. So it's very easy to miss them. It's very easy to see a young man who is becoming challenged and beginning to show the signs of burnout, to just see an angry, shut down man rather than a man who's really crying out for help.
Well, certainly. I mean, I know that businesses aren't and organizations aren't known for necessarily being family friendly, even though they a lot of times say they are. And you're right. I believe there's still that pressure to be the provider. I mean, when I was coming up, that was expected from males. You were the provider. I fortunately had a partner who also worked, and we were able to work that out together. But I was never given time to be a father from my work. There was no understanding that that was important. And I think we still, in a lot of ways, don't have that yet. Even though the young men coming up now really crave it. I mean, I can see how they want to be so much more involved with their children's lives. So,
Yes, and when like there's before this conversation, I did a fair bit of research about. I knew some, but I wanted to be
mhm,
more um, aware of what paternity leaves were like in a variety of countries. And what surprised me more than anything else was that Japan is, on paper, one of the better countries aside from like the Nordic countries. And when I read it, I thought this can't be right. And I went back and fact checked and all that. And apparently, on paper, there are really good accommodations. But the fact of it is that culture does not encourage that or support it. So you might be able to have that benefit
sure.
on paper, but should you take it, you're going to pay the price. So once again, um, like it's really as far as the workplace goes, you're right that young men are craving for the opportunity to be more active in their families, but they still want to be the provider. They that fills something in them to provide for the people that they love. So if the workplace doesn't understand the uniqueness of this generation of young man, then they're not going to be in a position where they can give, when they're at work, give everything they can to work. When they're at
Sure.
home, give everything they can to their family at home. I think they're in a really rough spot at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it with colleagues and young men I've worked with. And as you know, on this show, we talk a lot about the intergenerational teams and stuff. And part of it is we need to teach, we tend to have, if there are older people in the group who learned it a different way, they need to understand the needs of these young men. But also vice versa, they need language in order to teach it to the workplace. So
Yeah, there's a gap. There's
yeah.
a very definitely a big gap, and what I see more often than not is now really compassionate, understanding men, my
Mhm.
generation, or even a bit older, but I mostly can refer to my generation, who have the empathy, but because they are still very much stuck in their own upbringing as far as what it meant to be the provider. So they don't understand, how these young guys aren't kind of killing themselves with work because that was the work ethic that we grew up with.
Yes, it
And
was. Yeah.
and even though these men are, exceptional men in so many ways, there seems to be, you know, just not the awareness and the knowledge of really what it means to be a young man today. And I think that's what's missing. I think the intergenerational thing is kind of like your golden sauce in everything because there is so much wisdom to be learned on both ends. But I think it takes a certain kind of softness to be able to explore, okay, that wasn't the way for me, but how can we work together and make the best of where we are right now?
Certainly, and that comes back to it. It was learning on either side, that communication, finding that common language. I give kudos to these young men that they are not putting up with what my generation put up with.
I
I
agree.
would have been afraid in my career. I would have been afraid to walk away from work to be with my son, even
Yeah,
though I know
they are
how
brave.
important even though I know how important it is for fathers to parent their sons. And it wasn't acceptable. It's like, what do you mean you want to go to his soccer game or something like that? Um, you got work to do. And there was no understanding at all. There was no paternity leave. It wasn't even thought of. It was like, why would you need that?
Mhm. Yeah.
He's got his mother. What do you need that for? So I think it's great that they're pushing back and saying, no, this is important. Raising our children is really a sacred thing for and to have that involvement is beautiful. But where do we make space for them? What do fathers really need from work today in order to, help them work in both sides of their lives?
Well, again, I think it's the awareness first, the awareness that their priorities are different. They do,
Hmm.
you know, young men who are able to find those jobs that they really do want to work, like,
Right.
they have found this company or this position and they're really keen on it. But they also know that, they they still need to be able to come home and be present with their children. There's quite a few men that I spoke with who had fathers who were very caring, very loving. But that was the difference. That was what they didn't get from their fathers because when they were home, they were not really present. They were there physically, but they were still doing some work or just not being home as much as they should have been. Um, so that part, hasn't that part is still there for that's not as good as it can be. But if these men find a company whose leadership or policies recognize the importance and the value and take precautions to accommodate those needs and challenges. Like we do that for women. We provide the rooms if they want to, pump so that they can continue to breastfeed while
Sure.
they're still working. We make accommodations for women, but we don't for our men. So I think that's one of the things is just recognizing the differences, the challenges, and the ways of expressing themselves so that we can tune in a little better to just how to help them thrive.
Yeah, but I think a lot of especially larger companies are structured that if you want to move up into the higher levels, you need to be on site all the time. You need to put in more hours. You're expected to put aside your outside life. And, from what you're telling me, a lot of young men nowadays don't want that anymore. It's not that they don't want to succeed and provide for their families, but their priority is different than that
Yes.
traditional corporate means of doing things.
When you look at some of the other societies, like we look at, Sweden and
Hmm.
Finland and some of those places, when I look at it from an outsider's point of view, it's like, well, their culture seems to prioritize families. And that's the
Yes.
bottom line. Whereas a lot of other countries, like Japan, like North America in many ways, the focus is on business, creating the economy, making the
Hmm.
country stronger at the expense of the family unit.
Yeah, I mean, we see that very much in the United States here, that it they talk about being family friendly, but the structure is not there. The support's not there. The child care is not there. The
Yeah.
All those kind of things, because we live in a world where pretty much both parents have to be working just for
Mhm.
economic reasons. And from what you're telling me, these men really want to share in that parenting. So both parents really need an opportunity to have a workplace that allows that. And there's more awareness with women simply for the biology that they're having, and the
Yeah.
traditions we've had for thousands of years. But yes, I know I've looked at some of the things that happen in, the Nordic countries, and this the shared, you know, um, parental leaves and things like that, where they can
Mhm.
decide who gets it, and the flexibility is unbelievable, and the guarantee that when you come back, your job's still waiting for you.
I
That's not
think when
something that
I'm
we do here. Yeah,
no,
go ahead.
and I think just as far as companies goes and intergenerational workers
Hmm.
together and specifically for men and fathers, when I look at maybe what would be the ideal situation, I think there's another component that is missing in our society, and that's a lot of young men don't have mentorship. They don't
Yeah.
have rites of passage. They don't have someone saying, okay, listen, this is tough, but you are strong enough to be in this position. I can support you, but these are the expectations in a way that brings out, the strength in a male. And
Hmm.
I don't think we have that kind of system where there are older men who are saying, this is different, your generation is different, I understand it's different, I'm trying to understand the way you think about things, and let me share what I know from the past and what worked and what didn't, because there's a lot of men from our generation, if they can be vulnerable, the wisdom that they have to share about working, is invaluable. When a man in a leadership position can say, I wish I had have spent more time when my children were young. That's that's an understanding that is going to make a big difference in that father's productivity and commitment.
Yeah, and there's some groups that are trying to do some of those rites of passage, but
Mhm.
it's been traditional in many societies for the elders to carry those stories. They took the boys and the young men and helped them through that transition to become men, and we've lost that. We,
Yeah.
especially here in the States, we have a very youth-oriented culture, and some of that respect is not there. So it's, that's an incredible point where that mentorship, and that ties into we talked about the intergenerational piece, that communication, giving on both sides, learning on both sides. That's pretty powerful.
Without It is, and without those rites of passage or that understanding, what you end up with is young men who are still acting like boys.
Hmm.
They're still risk taking. They're aversive to deep responsibility. Like there is a definite impact on a young man who hasn't had some recognition and support as he moves from boyhood into manhood.
Yeah, that's critical. Okay, well, we're going to take a short break for hear from one of our sponsors. When we come back, I'd like to talk a little bit more about that, but I also want to hear about some of the work that you're doing with, helping boys and helping parents raise boys so they can become, you know, full men. So we'll be right back. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, this is Bridging of Ages. We're talking about fathers in the workplace with my guest, Kathryne Imabayashi. We were just talking about, rites of passage and stuff. And I know you've written a couple books and you have this coaching business in order to help parents raise young men and help that awareness in men so they can really fulfill some of those things that they're looking for. And I'd love to hear about a little bit about what your work has found and what you're teaching.
So I started the business part of it 6 years ago, but I've been in education for 40 years. So part of my wisdom comes from experience working with parents and children and moving into leadership roles towards the end of my career. I work with all parents, all families, but my insights are on young boys. So that's where I spend a lot of my own time. But I work with all parents. So usually I do presentations. I do, support for parents like PTA groups or things like that. I have my podcast where I connect with anyone who's connected with parenting, with masculinity, with mental health issues. And most of of course, I've got the website, I have online courses, I have these 2 books. There's a lot of things going on. But mostly what is the most exciting thing for me is when a parent reaches out because they're in crisis and everything. And it just happens that 9 times out of 10, they have a little boy.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So my preference is always to work one-on-one because every child is different, every parent is different, every need is different. And so I just kind of pick out of my, magic bag and tune into where they are, where they want to go, what the issues are, and what simple, practical tools I can give them. And we go from there.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I also wanted to circle back. You talked about the rite of passage that seems to be missing in today's world. I have involvement in the Mankind Project. I don't know if you're familiar with it at all.
No.
And I am officially one of the elders in that organization. And we do have a rite of passage. And it is fascinating to watch these young men, especially in their 20s and early 30s, and the transformation they have because they never had that a lot of traditional groups and indigenous groups, would take a boy when he was 13 or 14 and take him out of the village and put him through a rite of passage. And these young men never had that. And I think you had mentioned that they're still boys. But over this initiation weekend, the transformation is unbelievable. But what's also there is a structure of what to do afterwards, because the work is always a work in progress. And I'm sure you've found that with your clients and with the young men that you've interviewed. Um, and I'm sure
I
there's
do.
other organizations that are doing that.
It's becoming more like you can find it if you search for it. You can, but
Right.
it's still not common. When our son was moving into his teen years, I had just a few years before that started reading and understanding more about rites of passage. And because at the time we had just moved to a new country, we were living in Beirut, didn't have family or anything there. But for his 13th birthday, I put together a rites of passage, just very simple, but brought together a group of men. And it was one of the most beautiful things that I had seen. And then fast forward to very recently, my son was preparing for fatherhood for the first time.
Sure.
And I was thinking again about the rites of passage, and I was listening to something, and the man who was speaking said something about similar to a rites of passage into fatherhood. And so I reached out to the same men that had helped my son when he was 13 and asked them if they could follow the similar pattern just to prepare some guidance and support as he was moving into a new thing. And I hope it did as much for my son as it did for me. And I'm on the outside because I'm a woman.
Sure.
It's like those little things, I do believe, mean a lot. And not just to the man who's receiving, but to the man who is giving, to the man
Yes.
who, right, and saying, I remember when my first child was born and this was this and this was that. And just wait till this happens. And just beautiful connection of community, like the village raising the child that we have lost.
Sure. Yeah. And, I mean, I get some of this in this organization, which I really appreciate. But you're right. I stumbled across it initially. I didn't know about it. And I got it later in life. But it really is, you can really see it with young men, how important it is to have that. And I talk a lot on my show about mentorship, but I really believe that mentorships aren't successful unless the information and learning is going both ways. And, and it doesn't matter who the mentor is, because as an older man, I can learn from a younger man and vice versa. And it comes back to that openness that you talked about, which is really beautiful. So I love how you've tied together, this idea of helping parents and helping kids, and then also taking it farther in those rites of passage, and how you've interviewed all these young men and gotten an insight into what their needs are. And that's really been wonderful to just hear your insights and how you are working to make that piece of the world a little better. So
the one thing I will say is that, like, I have spent more than 3 decades trying to understand better about the inner emotional world of boys. I've done a lot, but it was truly in the last year when I put my total focus on having conversations about this topic with the young men. And that was, I think, the missing part. Is kind of like, this is where the real story is. And all they need is a space and a receptiveness to share. And then we can learn from that and build upon that. But that's been the most powerful thing, is having the actual conversations with young men and dads.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for talking with us today. We're going to take a short break, one of our sponsors, and then I'll come back and just do a little wrap up and look at some of the action items and tips that we can get from our wonderful conversation with Kathryne. Thank you. We'll be
Thank you
right
for
back.
having me.
Welcome back to Bridging of Ages. If you're just joining us, today we've been talking about fathers in the workplace. And we'd like at this point to give you some action items and some tips that you can use to utilize some of the great insights that my guest, Kathryne Imabayashi, has been talking about today. Let's take a look at our action items. Action item 1, understand fathers' needs in your organization. Do you really understand why they need to also work with their family, not just work where you are? The workplace has changed and the people in it have. There's very different expectations from the younger generations than the way it's always been done. And I've talked many times in previous shows about how we should move away from, well, that's the only way we've always done it, and that's the way we will, because it always changes, it always evolves. Action item 2, learn about developing remarkable men. So we talked about rites of passage, what it takes to build and help young men, how it starts as boys and those difficulties that they have in our society. So really take a little time and learn about the different ages and needs of the men in your organization. Action item 3, recognize how outside affects work inside. If you want them to be working all the time and they can't be involved in their family and other activities that are important to them, they are going to burn out. They're not going to be able to do the work that you feel is necessary. By allowing them and giving them that space, you're actually going to up your productivity, and they will be much more engaged, and the innovation will be much more effective. So just to review again, our action item 1 is understand fathers' needs in your organization. Action item 2, learn about developing remarkable men. Action item 3, recognize how outside affects work inside. And the tip for today is both parents need work-family balance, not just the women, but also the men. And if we're able to give it to everybody who works for us, you will find that it will be a much productive and more innovative workplace. This has been Bridging of Ages. My name is Dan Mendlevitz. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. You can find the QR code up in the corner. Thank you again from Bridging of Ages. Invest in brain power, fuel brilliance.